Good morning from the city of Philadelphia and from the University of Pennsylvania. I am Rudy Altamirano, and I am the Executive Director of the International Student and Scholar Services here at Penn, and will be the moderator for today's session. We are so glad you can join us for this important panel discussion focusing on U.S. immigration issues that impact our international students, our scholars, our faculty, and the families. At Penn, we are proud to host a truly global community, and we understand that navigating immigration rules, especially in today's complex and ever-shifting landscape, can be confusing, stressful, and sometimes intimidating. That's why we brought together trusted legal experts to help unpack these topics, address your real-world concerns, and provide practical, actionable advice. So whether you're here to learn about re-entry, travel risk, visa interview strategies, status transitions after optional practical training, or how to protect your rights at the border, this session is for you. And no question is too small or too specific. Our goal is to equip you with knowledge and confidence as you make important decisions for yourself and your family. So thank you so much for being here. And with that, I'm honored to introduce our two guest speakers. Today, we are fortunate to have Elise Fialkowski and Karen Pollins with us to help demystify some of the key aspects of immigration law. You can see Elise Fialkowski's photo there. She's the co-chair of her firm's corporate immigration practice with over 25 years of experience in employment-based immigration. She represents multinational corporations, startups, and private individuals specializing in visas such as J1s, temporary work visas, and green cards. Elise also leads the worksite compliance group, advising on I-9, E-Verify, and H-1B labor condition application compliance. Recognized by Best Lawyers in America and Pennsylvania Super Lawyers, Elise was named Lawyer of the Year in 2022. She holds a JD from Villanova University School of Law and BA from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Joining Elise today is Karen M. Pollins. She's a partner and chair of her firm's medical and research team with extensive experience in employment-based immigration for healthcare and research institutions. She specializes in H-1Bs, O-1s, EB petitions, J-1 waivers, and more. And recognized by Super Lawyers and Best Lawyers, Karen is chair of the Philadelphia chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. And fluent in Spanish, she holds a JD from Temple University, and also is very excited to join us here. We are truly grateful to have Elise and Karen with us today, and their extensive knowledge will help us guide through the complexities of immigration law and answer questions that matter most to our global community. We look forward to hearing from both of them and encourage you to take full advantage of this opportunity to engage with them. So I will have Elise and Karen do a presentation first, trying to cover all the questions that you sent us prior to this webinar. And then after that, we will open the floor for more moderated question and answer. Elise and Karen, take it away from here. Go for it.
Thank you so much, Rudy. And thank you, so many of you for joining us. Rudy told us that we have quite a few from the Penn community attending. So what do Karen and I want to cover today? We worked very closely with Penn and Rudy to incorporate your questions, to incorporate your concerns. We've built in a lot of your questions already into the PowerPoint, and we're happy to take additional questions at the end. So we're going to cover consular processing, travel and port of entry concerns, social media, device searches, visa revocations and CVIS terminations, the new registration requirement, non-immigrant visa options, and immigrant visa options. So we're going to end it on a high note, and let's dive in to a consular processing. And for the visa wait times and consular processing, we've seen many changes since the Trump administration started. In the beginning of the administration, the visa wait times that were posted for each embassy and consular post literally disappeared. For many months, all we had were the global visa wait times that were posted January 17th before the inauguration. Interestingly, they returned mid-April, but in a different format. We now have wait times, but they are global wait times. And unfortunately, they are not refreshed as frequently as the wait times were before. At this point, the wait times really are refreshed monthly. So I'm on the Department of State Liaison Committee with the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and we've had discussions with Department of State regarding the visa wait times. Department of State basically said they took the visa wait times down to modify the presentation. They were hoping to provide more accuracy. That's what they told us. But we only have them posted monthly. You'll see if you go into global visa wait times, and I think a lot of people are surprised when they see this. You'll go into the global visa wait times and you'll see timelines, right? And it's much more of a generalized timeline in terms of months and the like, or days or weeks. There are some consulates that actually have a zero next to them. I think people are very worried when there's nothing there. We've been told, as part of liaison from Department of State, that when there is nothing there, it's actually a good sign. It means that they are scheduling appointments in less than a month. So maybe that'll allay some fears. It's unusual though, because we were so used to having very exact timing in terms of number of days. We simply don't have that anymore. Um, so what else do we have in terms of changes? It no longer lists the visa interview waiver timing. We used to have interview waiver timing updated on the visa wait times. So, Karen, what happened to visa interview waiver timing? And what are the other changes that happened in terms of the interview waivers?
Yeah, thanks, Elise. And like you, I want to thank Rudy for organizing this webinar. I think it's very timely. Elise and I are getting inundated with questions. We know that students, scholars, and others, around the world are concerned about recent immigration developments. So thank you for having us. So yeah, as Elise mentioned, there have been changes to the interview waiver program. For years we were dealing, especially during COVID, with very lengthy processing times, especially when consulates were closed and then reopened, sort of coming out of COVID. To reduce these appointment wait times, the Biden administration expanded those who were eligible for waivers. Many of you might know them as the Dropbox appointments. So you're sending your documents, via Dropbox, and you do not need to appear for an actual interview at the consulate. And this was great. And they expanded it to basically those who had a visa in any non-immigrant visa classification except B. So, if I had a prior F1 and now I'm seeking an H1B, I may be eligible. You had to be applying within 48 months of the most recent visa expiration. The Trump administration, though, in late February rolled back who is eligible for the interview waivers. So now that prior visa that you had has to have been in the same non-immigrant visa category, and you have to be applying within 12 months. So that's something that we expect will increase processing times, and we're keeping an eye on. And as Elise mentioned, now we don't really have an idea so much of the wait time on that. We also are seeing, and we'll discuss throughout this webinar, enhanced vetting for students. There was a directive to consular officers to engage in enhanced social media vetting for those in F1, J1, and M1 status, more scrutinizing of social media profiles. And basically that screening mandate is for a consular officer who has a reason to believe that a person has openly advocated for a terrorist organization. Although I will note, that sounds serious, but it's quite an expansive reading, I think, of who might fall under that. Also, those who previously were in F1, J1, or M1 status between October 7th of 2023 and the end of August of 2024, or those applicants who had their CVIS record terminated. We're also going to talk about CVIS record terminations later on, but basically if the record was terminated between October 7th of 23 and today, then that is someone who's going to have this, increased or enhanced social media vetting. So Elise and I also want to talk about the DS-160. And what I'll say about that, I know many of you have been through this process before. Maybe some incoming students who have been accepted to a degree program but haven't yet applied or are new to the DS-160. But this is essentially the application for the non-immigrant visa that is submitted to the consulate in connection with that visa application. It requires significant information. It takes a long time to complete. And, really the thing we want to underscore mostly is that you want to be accurate. You really want to take your time in completing that application. You want to be truthful in your responses. You want to double check for accuracy before you actually submit it. The system can be a bit finicky. So if you're working on it, you have the ability to save it and go in and out, but we advise you to save it frequently, just to make sure that you don't lose information. And it's really important to disclose issues, and those issues could be a prior visa denial, a criminal citation or charge. The last thing you want to do is just ignore or hide that, because that is has very serious consequences and will likely result in the denial of the visa. And it may be good to speak with an immigration attorney if you have those, those types of issues. And one other thing we just wanted to point out was that consulates are now requiring that DS-160 submission 48 hours before the appointment. We've seen it in London, India, Paris, and likely others will follow suit. And they can cancel it if it's not submitted within the time frame. The interview can be canceled, and when you arrive, your DS-160 has to match. In the past, you could submit a DS-160, modify it, bring a new DS-160 to the appointment, and that is no longer the case. So having spoken a bit about the DS-160 and the application itself, Elise, maybe you want to talk a little bit about preparing, for the visa interview process.
Yeah, so I want to talk about preparing for the interview process, and I also want to highlight some of the very new changes regarding the DS-160 that reflect the enhanced vetting, I think. So the consulates are now requiring that you submit that DS-160, as Karen said, 48 hours before the appointment. They're also requiring that it be the same DS-160 at the appointment. So all of the numbers must match in terms of what the full DS-160 is and the appointment. We think that they implemented this requirement across a number of consulates, and we see it increasing, and it likely will impact all consulates because they are doing more pre-screening of the DS-160s prior to the appointment. So if you submit your DS-160 and you're then looking for an appointment and you see something within 24 hours, you're thrilled, you book it, they will require you to reschedule if you appear for that appointment. When you appear for the appointment, what is important? I really cannot stress enough that preparation is key. There's a lot that goes into the process of you working with Penn to get your DS 2019, to get your I-20, to be admitted in the program and be able to apply for the visa. But once you get to that visa interview, the visa interview is likely 2 minutes. That is it. You need to be prepared to clearly explain why you're applying for a visa, and you need to have all of the key documents. You are your own advocate at the consulate, and you need to be prepared. Now, the documentation to support the application, that's going to vary depending upon what type of visa you're applying for, right? If you're an F1 student, please follow the guidance that ISS is giving you, right? Penn has an fantastic international student and scholar services office. They're going to give you good guidance. Generally, any student is going to want to bring a number of things, right? You're going to want to bring clearly your I-20, any related invitation letters. You're going to want to show that you have the ability to pay for the program as well. And you're going to want to show that you meet the temporary intent requirements, right? You're going to want to show that you have a home abroad. And we'll talk in a little bit with some questions about what kind of documentation you can present there. And the documentation may vary if, for example, you are with Penn and you have an H-1B. If you have an H-1B approval with Penn, you're going to want to have your H-1B approval notice and any related documentation. Often a letter is helpful. We're seeing the consulates, especially if the approval is not immediate, right? If the approval was more than a month ago, the consulates are requiring evidence. Hey, does Penn still want you as an H-1B? And so you may want updated letter. If you got a change of status to H-1B in the United States, and now you're applying for a visa, they're going to want you to show that you are complying with H-1B status, right? They're likely going to want your pay stubs as well if you're applying for an H-1B visa after the fact. So it really depends upon the visa type, what documentation you're going to bring. And we're happy to talk about particular cases and documentation. One other thing that I want to highlight that applies to everyone who applies for a visa in terms of what to bring. Of course, we all know you need your passport, right? But look at the date on your passport and when your passport expires. You want a passport that is valid for the whole duration or expected duration of your stay, ideally, if you can, plus an additional 6 months if possible. If you don't have a passport that is valid for the full duration, you may be limited when you enter the United States, particularly if you're in a visa category that gets an I-94 document when you enter that has a specific date, like an H-1B. Your I-94 and ability to stay in the United States will be limited to the validity of your passport. So that is really important to think about at the time you're applying for the visa, when you are getting ready. What else is really important for everyone to bring? We all live in a digital world. We live with our phones. We live with our tablets. You scheduled your appointment and submitted the DS-160 online, right? You have your DS-160 and appointment confirmation on your phone. You do not want to show your phone to the consular officer. You need to print that out and bring that with you, and they are going to be reviewing those documents. What else is important in terms of preparation? I think you want to be able to quickly and succinctly answer the question, why are you applying for this visa? Right? And it depends upon the type of visa. It has to be natural, right? We don't want it necessarily to be too much of a script. You have to be able to clearly explain in your own words why you're applying for the visa, what the visa type is, and know what the underlying requirements are to quickly answer the question. When we assist people with consular processing, my firm often does a prep call, and I play the difficult consular officer. And I work with folks who are applying to really answer the questions quickly, truthfully, and reasonably. So Karen, let's talk about other trends that may impact folks at the consulate. In terms of what may impact folks at the consulate, other things that we are seeing are potential reductions in consular staff. What does that mean? That means that the visa interview wait times may get longer. The good news right now is even though we have already seen some restructuring in the Department of State and some reductions, the appointments are still generally available and they are not extraordinarily delayed in many locations. In many locations across the world, you're often able right now to get an appointment within a month, and at the outside, at some locations too. There are some locations where it takes much longer to get an appointment. I really want to emphasize that folks should be aware of that global visa wait times page and look at it. But we really do expect that those processing times may slow. So we recommend that you apply as early as possible once you have your documentation. So for example, if you're an F1 student coming over, don't wait till a month before you're planning to come on campus to go through the process and schedule your visa interview. In the last year or so, the Department of State has expanded the ability for F1 students to apply for their visas earlier, right? It used to be that you could only apply shortly before you're coming over. Now you can apply within a year. Query whether that's reasonable, who has all of their admission documentation at that time. But once you have your documentation, if you're outside the United States, please work to schedule your visa appointment consistent with the time you need to come to the US. So apply early. Karen, you alluded before to additional scrutiny. Do you want to kind of tease out what may be happening at the consulate with regard to social media or any posts or activity that visa applicants may have engaged in?
Sure, Elise. And yeah, as we mentioned earlier, there's this new policy of enhanced social media vetting for those seeking F1, M1, and J1 visas. We actually do have a slide where we go into this in a little bit more detail in a bit. So, I won't belabor the point now. But I do want to just point out that this is, when you're thinking about what is in your sort of digital footprint online, just keep in mind that they have a very expansive view of what is adverse to current administration policy. So, clearly if you post something, that's very critical or, pro-terrorist group or something like that, okay, that's a bit obvious. However, we've seen and heard sort of anecdotally of issues where people have shared a post, they didn't even write the post, or even liking a post could potentially be an issue. So we're certainly advising people to be very careful about, what they are posting, sharing, liking, etc. online, and just keeping in mind, that this administration is taking a very expansive read on this adverse to current administration policy issue. But we'll touch upon that again in a bit. It might be helpful to turn to some, visa processing questions. And Elise, you really helped set us up for preparing for that interview and thinking about what to expect and having documents in order. But if I'm an F1 student, once I complete my DS 160, is it enough to kind of go with that confirmation page and my I-20 issued by my school? Will that be enough, or will I need additional documents?
Sadly, no. And I think I alluded to some of this before, right? I mean, if you're an F1 student, you're going to need additional documentation. I think the key documentation is going to be your valid passport, right? Your DS-160 confirmation, your appointment, of course, your I-20, right? You're going to need all of that. But there's other documentation that the consulates are really asking for now as well. They're often also asking for the financial status, right? Are you paid? Do you have the ability to pay for the program? It's often helpful to have, just in case, your admission letter as well. We're seeing some consulates ask for that. Other things that are helpful are ties. What are your ties to your home country? And are you going to come back? Now, the Foreign Affairs Manual was updated a little over a year ago to really kind of talk about students in particular and the kind of documentation and the analysis that consular officers should be conducting in terms of intent. Now, that update was during the Biden administration. That update basically said, students quite often are young. They quite often don't have that many contacts. They may seek to study in the US after an initial program. It may not just be a bachelor's program, it may be a master's program. And that Foreign Affairs Manual section basically says consular officers should obtain documentation, but give students some leeway. So it's very amorphous though, right? So what is that leeway? At the end of the day, I think you need to look at your situation and how you can show what your plans are. The consular officer will want a reasonable explanation of your plans and what you're going to be doing in the United States. A lot of times it helps to weave in, if they ask you the question, why you're studying in a particular program, right? I have always wanted to study engineering. The engineering program at Penn is one of the best in the world. I was so excited to be admitted to Penn for their top flight engineering program. My family is so supportive. I'm very close to my family. Once I'm done my studies, I plan to return to my family. They're all located. They're all located here. Um, I have documentation. This is where our house is, and then you may have a deed, you may have a lease, and the like. if you're not a student and you're not young, it's not just family members you're going to allude to and where they are, but if you have any property or the like. Karen, any other ideas? I know we were going back and forth with kind of a laundry list of, gee, what can you show ties to home with? And I think it really
Yeah.
varies depending upon where you are in your life.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of inherently difficult for students, right? Because,
Yeah.
you know, our F1 students are coming, they're really at the start, you know, they're starting their education and their careers. And, you know, it can be challenging to establish ties to the home country for an F1. You know, typically what we're looking at for, you know, visas that require non-immigrant intent are those personal, professional, financial ties. You know, if most of your immediate family is in your home country and you can prove your relationship via birth certificates, marriage certificates, whatever the case, and their residence there, that can help. You know, people often cite like future job offers, but most people coming into a degree program don't have that, you know, sort of future job offer. But certainly, you know, financial documents, ownership, even like involvement in your community and community activities and religious organizations and things like that can certainly help. But yeah, it's challenging for students.
Right. I think that's a great list. So another question that we received related to processing times after interview. There was a question. I submitted my J visa application in Tel Aviv on April 30th. I still haven't received a reply. How long does it usually take? So Karen, how would you help that J visa applicant?
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, you know, visa processing times really vary from consulate to consulate. Typically, though, if there are no issues, visas are issued relatively quickly, you know, within days or a week, you know. What can trigger longer processing is when a case gets put in what we call administrative processing, where further action is needed. The consular officer felt like they did not have enough in front of them to make a determination about the visa issuance. And there are a variety of things that can trigger administrative processing, including incomplete documents or, you know, inaccuracies in documents, things, you know, supporting materials that the consular officer wants to see, but the applicant doesn't have. And again, that goes to speak to, you know, sort of coming prepared. But there are also, other things, you know, like background checks and things that can trigger administrative processing. And when it gets into that area, you know, the DOS has pretty broad authority to, you know, in the spirit of national security, take a reasonable amount of time to vet applicants. So sometimes we see things that are more related to national security concerns, and it could just be like the basic background checks. Some applicants who are involved in certain scientific or technological fields might be subject to administrative processing under the technology alert list, you know, ties to questionable organizations. But just because, I guess what I want to emphasize, especially to the individual that asked this question, is just because you're put into administrative processing doesn't mean that there's a problem and this is going to take forever. I think that historically, most administrative processing has resolved itself in, you know, days or a few weeks. It can take longer though. You know, we have seen in unusual cases, administrative processing take months and months, and even to the point where applicants sort of consider filing mandamus actions to compel the government to issue the visa and things like that. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves because, you know, April 30th is, you know, fairly recent, and maybe that person's, you know, even received news of their visa issuance. So that's certainly something we see happen a lot. Unfortunately for us attorneys, what's really frustrating is our ability to intervene is quite limited. You know, again, it goes back to this is a national security concern. I know a lot of the consulates used to say they wouldn't even consider an inquiry that occurred within 90 days. I mean, I think now we tend to follow up sooner. Oftentimes we have worked with, you know, universities or the employers to have them sort of submit an inquiry and or a letter explaining the urgent need to have that individual in the US. And that sometimes will shake things loose, and or getting like a congressperson to intervene. I think that has been helpful, although it's hard to say. I mean, I'm sure, Elise, you agree, during COVID and the prior Trump administration, I think the ability for those congressional liaisons to sort of get a positive response was diluted because so many people were seeking, subject to delays and seeking that. So, it's sort of a tough situation, but yeah, processing times, really vary.
So, Karen, I agree, right? I think, and if you talk to the Department of State, they will tell you that generally you can't expedite administrative processing,
Right.
right? That's the overall rule.
Yep.
Nevertheless, there is the option that Karen alluded to of mandamus if it is taking a very long time. But even though they say nothing can be done, there are some cases where we can make a compelling argument of need, where we have often worked with a senator or a congressman to really show that compelling need and why the person needs to be in the US. And I don't know if it's just a matter of timing, but it often seems that after we do that and we have a follow-up, but the follow-up is joined with this compelling need and usually a letter that we help craft, that sometimes it shakes loose, right? And in fact, quite often it shakes
Yeah,
loose.
exactly.
Right? So I wouldn't say it's something that we can't do. Sometimes it works. And
Right.
I think that what we've been hearing generally about students, and I want to temper some of the things that everyone is hearing in the news, right? And I think as a matter of course, the news tends to focus on the negative, right? And we see the news stories are focusing on difficulties, delays, people at the border who have issues. But at least right now, and what we expect in the near future, people are still getting visas, right? People are getting visas. They're getting visas generally in the normal course. Does that mean that I want folks to kind of take it easy and not apply early? Absolutely not, because we don't know if there'll be delays. But I do want to kind of comfort people that if you're prepared, if you have your documentation, people are getting visa appointments and they're getting their visas.
Absolutely, Elise. Yep, I agree. It's important to note that. I also see that we have a couple raised hands. I just wanted to say that we are trying to get through our presentation and leave time at the end to answer some questions. So for those of you that have raised your hands, if maybe you can just sort of tuck those aside and, we'll see what we can address, at the end. Now, Elise, so let's say I get my visa. Yay, I get my student visa. I come into the US. I start my degree program. I have, an I-20 that's valid, perhaps for my full degree program. But my visa was only issued for a shorter amount of time, say a year. What happens? Do I need to renew that? Can you explain a little bit the distinction there?
So that is a absolute fantastic question, and it's one that we get all the time, right? I think you have to think about the visa itself as your ticket to entry to the US, right? Your visa needs to be valid at the time when you present yourself at the airport, at Customs and Border Protection, or at a port of entry, right? A land port of entry. Your visa needs to be valid at that time to get into the United States. But for F1 students, once you are inside the United States, what controls is your I-20. Students who come into the United States get an I-94 departure record that says D/S or duration of status. Where does that duration of status comes from? it ties into your I-20. And your I-20 will control the period of time that you can stay in the United States. So there is additional flexibility for students who come into the United States because they get that duration of status that ties to the I-20. There's a lot of students who come to us and say, oh my gosh, my visa is expiring in 6 months. I need to go get a new visa. I still have 2 more years on my program, but my visa expires in 2 months. I need to go get a visa. You do not. You can stay in the United States as long as you have a valid I-20 and continue the program. Um, so I think that's really important to stress, particularly now, right? When visa wait times may lengthen, scrutiny at the border is higher, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. You don't have to travel. Now, if you do need to travel and your visa is expired, absolutely, you need to go outside the United States to get a new visa. And and you're going to need that visa before you come in. There's no process to renew the visa in the US. And we get that question, but as long as your I-20 is fine and you're in the US, you're okay.
Great, Elise. That's really helpful. All right, so go ahead.
No.
So now we've focused a little bit on the consular side of things and, applying for a visa. We want to talk too more generally about travel issues that might impact not only those people that are applying for their first visas, but people that are already in the United States and, are nervous in terms of what they're hearing. And I think it was really important what Elise said about, the news kind of focusing on the negative. And I think I cannot open my internet browser these days without seeing some. I'm sure the algorithm is tweaked to what I'm interested in and what clickbait gets me. But it's always about someone having issues with CBP or denied entry or detained and this. And I think we do need to take a step back and say, okay, like what is really, really going on here? And I'll just mention that based on the last Trump administration, where there was a travel ban for several Muslim majority countries, and that essentially dropped overnight. So, we had clients who were away at conferences, visiting family that were absolutely stuck outside of the US. We have learned that we do have to be careful. And based on President Trump's administration coming in January and the issuance of executive orders, there was a lot of chatter that, okay, well, by the end of March, based on anticipated timelines, we're going to have this, travel ban impacting all these countries. So, kind of where are we today? The only real, country-specific issue we're having right now is with South Sudan. April 5th, the Department of State announced that it would revoke all existing visas held by South Sudan passport holders and ban the issuance of new visas. This is due, and we've seen this with other countries, due to Sudan's alleged failure to accept return of its citizens who were removed from the United States. There were a couple high-profile cases. There was a lot of back and forth. There was the individual who, they claimed was Congolese, who was sent there. Sudan sent them back. A lot of back and forth. I think the Prime Minister has said that they are willing to work with and accept their people who are verified nationals of South Sudan. But at this point, I am not aware of anything that has changed the administration's policy on this. So, this is certainly a cause for concern for people from South Sudan that, don't perhaps have another like dual nationality that they can rely on to enter the US and who really need that visa, to come here. And I think it's a dynamic developing situation that we need to continue to monitor. And kind of keep an eye on. But Elise, so going back to that late March, we're all sort of waiting imminently for a big travel ban to drop and refreshing our browsers and, the list and all of that. So tell us, what is the state of things with other more general travel bans?
Right. So it's really interesting. I think a lot of us expected a travel ban day one, right?
Yeah.
Right. A lot of us expected day one. And then we learned that the Department of State was vetting countries, vetting information, and they were expected to provide all of that information to the administration by the end of March. That deadline was extended. It's our understanding that Department of State has already done that analysis. Right around that time, I think many of you probably saw there was a New York Times article that listed countries that may be subject to the travel ban. And they listed a potential framework, right? There were red countries, there were orange countries, and there were yellow countries. Um, After that New York Times article, I met with Department of State as part of the American Immigration Lawyers Association liaison committee. The discussion was very interesting. While they said they could not disclose details, they pretty clearly said, and we've heard this through our Washington contacts, we have an office in Washington, D.C., as well as Philadelphia and New York. So our feet on the ground contacts in DC have pretty much said that that New York Times list is not likely to be any list that we get for a travel ban. And more, what we're hearing is there's this indefinite delay for the travel ban. So we're kind of in a limbo right now. We may have a travel ban, we may not. It's interesting politically because in DC, there's a lot of discussion that the administration may be delaying a travel ban because of concerns about the upcoming World Cup and the Olympics in LA that are coming up. So I think that's impacting a potential travel ban. But I still think we can't take the position at this point that it's done, right? That there's not going to be any travel ban with this administration. And I think we need to realistically inform ourselves with regard to what happened during the last administration and countries that may be seen as countries of concern with this administration. So certain countries in the Middle East that were included, or the Muslim countries, right? Everyone referred to it as the Muslim ban in the past. Other countries that are high profile right now in this administration and targets for some other matters, right? Like Venezuela and some other countries. Um, so I don't think we can say there's no travel ban. I think perhaps that New York Times list is somewhat supportive, but not at the end of the day a final list. It's going to be a list if there's a travel ban that is determined by the administration and the executive is what we've been told from our DC contacts. Um, so what does that mean for travel, right? Um, I think it means for travel in terms of general guidance that it's a multi-factor analysis and an evaluation of risk when you want to travel. I think you need to evaluate a lot of the different risk factors that we are talking about here. What country are you from? Is it a country of concern if you're traveling? Um, do you have a currently valid visa? Right? Do you have a currently valid visa to travel? If you don't have a currently valid visa, what are those global visa wait times right now? And have you been subject to administrative processing in the past? I think a lot of folks think quite reasonably, I mind you, I think, if I've been subject to administrative processing before, they vetted me. I'm okay. I'm not going to get administrative processing again. Guess what? That is wrong. And I think it's a reasonable assumption that a lot of people have, but we see the opposite at the consulates. If you've had administrative processing in the past, you are likely to have it again. So, what else do you look at in terms of evaluating travel? Um, Certainly, countries of concern, whether or not you have a visa, um, your background, right? What is in your background? Are there any incidents in your background that could raise scrutiny? Karen's already talked about social media vetting, right? There's a lot of social media vetting. So it's not only at the visa application stage. It's also at the stage before you apply for entry to the United States with Customs and Border Protection. Um, I have also, for many years, been on the Customs and Border Protection Liaison Committee. It's very clear from my work on that committee that the airports often vet individuals who are trying to enter the United States before the plane even lands. There are information sharing agreements between all of the airlines and US Customs and Border Protection. So CBP, before your plane lands, has that list and goes through the list. What are some of the things that they do when they go through the list? They're going to look for any criminal activity, any arrests, any hits there. And more, they're also looking for social media activity. So, certain travelers, if perhaps there's any interaction with the law, I think that's how I like to phrase it with folks now. If there's any interaction with the law, or if you engage in any activity that could be viewed to be contrary to the interests of the United States and it's on social media, potentially you could be pulled aside. And I think the risks are higher in terms of whether or not you're going to come in. So I think those are at least some of the things to consider. And I think we all need to remember that just getting that visa is not the end of the day anymore, right? And CBP is very clear. U.S. Customs and Border Protection is very clear, where they will say, yes, Department of State issues the visa, but ultimately it is our decision as to whether or not the person will in fact be admitted to the United States. So you have now not only vetting at the visa stage, but you've got vetting and review quite often when you're going through CBP. Other things to think about when you're traveling before we go to the next slide. I do think in this current climate, it is often good to be prepared and have additional documents with you when you're traveling. Quite often, I tell folks, this is back pocket. You don't necessarily present it right away. When you're traveling, for example, when you're a student, your key documents are going to be your I-20 and your passport, right? But you know what? It doesn't hurt to also have a lot of that other documentation that you presented at the visa appointment. And if you've been a student for a while, it often helps to also have documentation that you've maintained status, right? I think we're seeing a lot more scrutiny at Customs and Border Protection now, even at some of the high volume posts. Karen, are you seeing similar things in terms of, hey, how do you prepare?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. And as you said, it's just important to think beyond, gone are the days where you just show up with your passport and visa
Right.
and,
Right.
get entry. And it doesn't mean, that it's not going to be a smooth, we have clients entering every day, no issues. It's very typical,
Right.
present the passport. Why are you here? Welcome, have a good, have a good stay. But yeah, I'm a big believer in, over prepare. So,
So yeah, I agree, Karen. I mean, I think what I like to do is say, bring the additional documentation. And by the way, make sure it's in your carry-on. Don't have it in your checked luggage because
exactly,
you're
yeah.
not gonna be able to get your checked luggage. You're not gonna be able to get
Exactly. Have it in, and I use that same, it's like the back pocket documents are like in the
back
back pocket
pocket.
documents, but you have them at the ready just in case you're asked.
Have them at the ready. I mean,
Yeah.
quite often we see that folks don't need it, but usually it's the times when you're really well prepared and you have the documents where they don't ask. And I don't know if that's kind of part of it is a confidence thing when you're going through inspections, right? If you know you're prepared, if you're ready, I think they sense that, and often
Yeah,
your admission is much easier.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So Karen, you want to jump in with some best practices? I think we talked about some of it,
Yeah, some
but
of these we
kind of
did, and
dive in.
we don't need to belabor the point. I'm actually going to put on my glasses since the font on this on this slide's a little bit smaller. So yeah, so we, stay informed of dynamic changes, right? So this is fluid, dynamic situation. As we sort of said already, we learned from the first go around that things can change overnight related to travel. So this is not the time to kind of have your head in the sand and just think, oh, everything will be okay, happy go lucky. This is, you want to keep abreast of the news and what's going on and that kind of thing. I won't get too much into documentation readiness. We talked about that. Obviously, just underscoring that you want to have the valid, unexpired, passport, I-20, EAD. Elise spoke about, how long the passport should be valid and that kind of thing before. And we also talked about having additional documents beyond the basic documents that you really need, when you're traveling. Digital cleanup. We are, going to talk a little bit. I'll talk in a few minutes about electronic searches that CBP is conducting. For now, what I'll just say though, and again, this goes to this vetting of social media, you want to pay attention to what you're posting. Perhaps go in and, remove outdated or sensitive posts. It's possible that they can see that things were deleted, but I think we want to err on the side of caution with that. It's good to keep the privacy settings as strong as possible on social media accounts, having that big open public profile where you're just posting all of your thoughts on Trump. Now is the time to scale that back, which kind of pains me as a lawyer and a defender of the US Constitution and the First Amendment to say that, but I'm going to be practical and give you practical tips. Some of you even said to consider limiting or temporarily suspending, location sharing features and posting about, where you are and what you're doing and your travel and that kind of thing. Even if you do have private accounts, I should note, because I just mentioned that, still may be subject to vetting. So just because you make your profile private doesn't mean that you can then, post whatever you want. So be very, very careful about that. And again, I guess the last thing I want to reiterate before I'll turn it over to Elise to discuss the last couple points on the slide, is just that, I really want people to err on the side of caution in terms of what is controversial. What we are seeing is a very, very liberal and expansive definition of what is adverse to our foreign policy and what the Trump administration is going to take issue with. They have issued a policy that, really all immigration benefits, even once you're stateside and applying for benefits with USCIS, anything that can be construed as anti-Semitic, is problematic. And, I know many students and scholars and others that might have views about, for example, like human rights in Gaza. In my mind, that's not an issue, but in this administration's mind, they can really extrapolate from that, and you don't want to go down a line where suddenly you're considered, pro-Hamas or something like that. So anyway, we'll touch base a little bit more on the device searches. But at least maybe you can, touch
Let
on these
me
last
round
two.
out what else,
Yeah.
and this kind of ties in with travel too, and what you're bringing. Well, everyone lives with their devices, your laptop, your phone, your iPad or tablet, and CBP, and Karen will talk about this more, takes the position that all of those electronic devices are no different than a suitcase, right? So one thing when you enter the US to help protect you is to minimize the data on those devices when you're coming in. And so if you can travel with a clean device that has the essential data that you need for the trip, it helps protect you. And the, the guidance for electronic searches also provides that the CBP officers, if they conduct an electronic search, are not supposed to be downloading information from the cloud. So if you have a clean device, you have everything on the cloud, turn any automatic download settings off. I think that helps protect you as well. At the end of the day, though, in terms of best practices for travel, I think it has to be a multi-factor analysis, really addressing a lot of the things that Karen and I have been talking about this morning. There are some attorneys that are recommending full stop that foreign nationals not travel in light of potential travel bans, in light of challenges on certain folks seeking reentry. I don't know, quite frankly, if that's realistic. I think it has to be a more reasoned, risk-based approach and analysis to decide whether or not to travel. And it's often helpful, particularly if you have some potential issue that we've highlighted in your background. So you may want to discuss with counsel. So let's talk about, we've been talking about social media a lot. So let's kind of talk about it in a little more detail. It's not limited at all, right? It's not limited to Facebook. It's not limited to Twitter. It's anything. And the government has very broad access. Um, and they will be tying information together that is given through various agencies. Because remember, this starts kind of how we started the presentation with the visa application process, where they're now asking for accounts, generally accounts over the last 5 years and your handles, right? So they're going to be asking for that information, and it goes through the travel process where they may be looking again. So we just listed, I'm not going to repeat all of them, just some examples of social media accounts. Just these are just examples, right? Any kind of account can be subject to review and access. And I think Karen alluded to this already. Be very thoughtful of the information that you post, particularly political views. Um, I think we're in a time period where anything that can be viewed at this point as contrary to the administration or potentially contrary to US interests or what the administration believes are US interests could potentially be a concern. And please remember, and I want to highlight this, I know Karen said it, but I think it's really important. A lot of the foreign nationals that I talk to think they are okay because they're private accounts. and they say it's only my private account, the government has very broad access. Don't assume you're safe if it's only within, for example, your friend group. So Karen, long awaited slide, electronic search.
The good old device searches. So yeah, I mean, CBP can search electronic devices. I liked what Elise said, devices are no different than a suitcase, right? They want to see what you're bringing into the country and, for any traveler entering the country, which includes US citizens, mind you. So this isn't just people that are coming on visas, green card holders, US citizens, anyone is subject to a CBP device search. There are two, we sort of briefly touched on this earlier, but there's two types of searches. The basic search, where a CBP officer is manually looking through the device without the aid of any external technology. And then there's what's called an advanced search, which is where they do use some external technology to help, review. They can extract data. CBP really needs to have, though, a reasonable suspicion of a violation of the law or a national security concern. And as far as we understand, they're supposed to also have pre-approval of the senior CBP manager before conducting an advanced search. But these are just the types of searches, anything, and this really is any device. So, phone, laptop, external hard drives, etc. Is subject, to a search. You don't need to provide passwords, but they can then confiscate the device, possibly even deny entry. I mean, you want to be careful. I think probably what's more important is what Elise alluded to, prior, is sort of thinking about what data is on your electronic device before you come to the US. Limiting what data is there, backing it up to the cloud or something that is separate from the actual device or laptop. Don't back it up on an external drive and then throw that in the backpack too, because that can be an issue. And just minimizing what's on there. And there is certain types of things that may be protected, like attorney-client correspondence. I work with a lot of individuals, in healthcare and sciences that could have sensitive patient data that may be HIPAA protected and things like that. I've been advising people to carry institutional policies with them about, not sharing that data. I tend to err on the side, though, of being cautious and removing it, because I really don't know how an individual CBP officer is going to react to oh, I have sensitive patient data on here. So sort of better to clean it up. I mean, I know people that have been going as far as just saying, I'm not even bringing my computer or, which is, as Elise said, virtually impossible. I think for most of us, these are like appendages for us. So I think the important thing is just to be aware of this. I have clients coming into the country every day and their devices are not being searched. It's important to be aware that they can. And, like any interaction that you have with CBP, if you go through the line and they take you to secondary inspection, that little side room to ask you more questions and look at your devices, you have a sense of why they're doing it and what they're looking for. It's important to not panic, just to stay calm, always be cooperative, with CBP. And, just understand they have this authority. And, hopefully it will be a quick, a quick thing. All right.
Okay.
So
So let's turn to some questions. So Rudy armed us with a lot of questions from all of you. So we want to cover as many as possible. So Karen, what are recommendations for postdocs attending international conferences or work meetings?
Yep. So this is the question we're getting every day. Every day we're seeing travel questions from individuals who, whether they're traveling for personal or professional or work reasons, are hearing the media stories and are getting concerned about what that means. And as Elise said earlier, I think it's really important to analyze the individual's own risk aversion and ask questions to determine whether you're at heightened risk based on what country you are from, whether you have a valid visa in your passport, and those sorts of things. There are ways that if you do this analysis and say, you know what, I think I'm safe to travel and I've been traveling and having no issue, and it's important that I go to this conference, and, everyone's in agreement. Some recommendations are to, carry with you, even if you have a valid visa. So you don't have to go to the consulate and apply for a new visa. You're just going to be going to the conference and then hopping on a plane back. Maybe think a little bit about, what you want to bring with you. So if I'm a postdoc on a J1, I'm going to bring my DS 2019. If I'm on an H1B, I'm going to bring my H1B approval notice. But I also advise you to bring proof of your ongoing employment as a postdoc, so like an employment confirmation letter or recent pay stubs. I also think it's really important to notify the institution. So, notify your department or the international office that you are going to be traveling, just so that everyone's aware in case there's any questions, when you come back. But I do, I just want to emphasize, I do have lots of clients who are planning to travel. They're not from sort of high-risk countries. They aren't applying for a visa, or they have no criminal issues in their background. So this is happening, but you definitely want to think more about, what you're bringing to facilitate your reentry. Elise, any thoughts on that? And also, how should people be thinking about traveling domestically? Okay, maybe I'll forgo international travel for now, but can I fly within the US? That shouldn't be an issue, right?
So I agree with, very much be prepared for international travel. So domestic travel, I think there is less risk, right? But particularly, and we'll have a slide about the registration requirement, particularly because of the new registration requirement. Um, I think it makes sense for foreign nationals to carry the documents that they could be asked for related to registration with them. So what is that? Honestly, it's the same documentation that we've been talking about that you should have when you're traveling internationally. Is it likely that you will be requested? I don't think so. I think that it will be very few and far between. But I think Karen and I, and we talked about this when we were preparing, I think we both like to take the approach of be prepared. And if you're prepared, you likely won't have issues. So, and many of you have driver's licenses, right? Yes, if it's a real ID driver's license, that may be all you need. But just in case, it is a good idea to bring your passport and any related documentation. So, for example, if you're a student, your I-20; if you're a J1, your DS 2019. But as we talked about before, kind of produce the minimum at the start. But I think it makes sense, based upon the registration requirement, to at least have that documentation. One thing that we also recommend as well, and it varies depending upon your category, what it's going to look like, is always when you come into the United States, go to the CBP I-94 website and pull your I-94. And I know we're in a digital world. You can save it on your phone, but I want you to print it, right? Just have that with you just in case. Your I-94 record shows that you were inspected, you were admitted to the United States. Now, if you're a J1 or an F1, it should just say D/S and tie into your documentation. But if you're, for example, on an H1B, it will have an end date. That is another good document when you're traveling internally to have with you, because that I-94 record is going to be evidence of your registration if requested. Okay. I think, Karen, we're going to move on because in terms of
Yeah.
time, so we want to quickly talk about student revocations. I think there's different kinds of visa revocations that we've been seeing. There's the prudential visa revocations that have been around for a very long time, right? We've been seeing prudential visa revocations for things like DUI related arrests or convictions for many years. There's notifications often aren't sent. Sometimes you learn about the prudential visa revocation just when you're trying to come in. Sometimes you do get a notice. But what else are we seeing? And this really kind of hit its stride, shall I say, in March, right? The visa revocations based upon the anti-Semitism executive order. It was really triggered by that executive order responding to the October attacks. It seems like a lot of the analysis and targeting of certain visa revocations has been AI driven. And i- it's not just a manual review. In discussions with Department of State has basically said they will use all tools available. When we look at visa revocations, a lot of times it appears that it may not have been vetted by a person. So we do think there's AI driven analysis that is really causing some of these visa revocations. We're also seeing visa revocations based upon criminal activity. What happened, it seems, is the criminal database was linked through an AI channel, and it was expanded to include additional items. We saw visa revocations without notice. Usually it was in the form of an email that came from the consulate basically saying the visa was revoked, often without any other information on the basis of the visa revocation. Sometimes there was information on the basis, but generally no notice. We also saw visa revocations based upon very minor infractions. They were things even including traffic violations in the past. So
I'll take it. I'll take it over while you
thank you as I'm coughing, and I'll try
grab
to.
a sip of water. I know that.
It's my allergies. I'm sorry.
No worries, Elise. I got it. So yeah, I mean, obviously the visa revocations were of great concern. There's some stats on this slide. There were more than 300 student visas that were, impacted. The thing about the visa revocations, and this goes back to what we said earlier about the distinction between your visa, which allows you to request entry into the United States, your visa document, and then once you're actually here, you're admitted pursuant to your, I-20 or DS-2019 or I-797. You're given that I-94 admission record, and that is really and truly what governs your ability to stay in the United States. So, in the past, and this isn't entirely new, like those prudential visa revocations for DUIs and other things have been happening for years and through various administrations. And typically how we would advise students when that happened was, okay, you're okay, your status is intact. But, this is something that needs to be addressed, should probably don't want to travel, speak with an attorney and that sort of thing. What also started happening, though, which was extremely disconcerting, was more than 1,500 F1 students and J1 exchange visitors across the U.S. had their CVIS records terminated. Most of you on F1s know what CVIS is. For those that don't, that's the system through which schools, oversee and report on students and exchange visitors that are here in the U.S. And there are certain things, failure to maintain status and full course of study, that could result in, the termination of someone's record. I think the number, I don't know what the final number was. It's probably way over 1,500. I'm pretty sure at the end of April inside higher ed said it was like over 1,800 students and recent grads, also people on OPT who had graduated, but people that were here on OPT were impacted. From more than 280 colleges and universities were impacted. And as Elise noted, with the visa revocations, same thing with the SEVIS terminations. No notice was going out. Well, and I guess with the visa revocations, they were sending notice to that, to
Sending
the
the
visa
emails.
applicant, but often emails that they used when they completed the DS-160. And I know,
Exactly.
right? Like a lot of them
Right.
didn't get it. So that was a big issue. But same thing with these SEVIS terminations, they were just happening quietly. And like we had the first university that we heard it from was someone, a DSO, who was doing sort of a simple update and audit and just sort of came across it by happenstance. So then, news is getting out, they're terminating these SEVIS records. So essentially it created a ton of confusion. School, and I mean, Penn was on it and very, organized about identifying and responding and, essentially conducting manual review of the SEVIS termination lists constantly so that they could then, inform students and that sort of thing. And I think, the biggest confusion was, the termination of the SEVIS record wouldn't necessarily impact their academic standing, but unlike a visa revocation, this sounds like they're no longer in status. Like, are they no longer in status? Is this a DHS determination that means they're now accruing unlawful presence? It was awful. And some students were deciding to leave and at the risk of, getting a new visa, very difficult. So what happened and where are we now, Elise?
So I think I have the good news on
Yes,
this, right?
definitely.
So, the immigration bar mobilized very quickly with the SEVIS terminations. And a lot of organizations, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and a lot of attorneys who've been involved in litigation, including one of our attorneys who's very well known for litigation, immediately started filing suit in federal court to restore the student's legal status. There is now a pending class action as well as many, many, many individual lawsuits that were filed to restore the student's legal status. In those cases, the students said that the termination was unlawful. There were allegations of violations of the Administrative Procedure Act. Um, it was pretty clear that throughout the course of the litigation, and these litigation actions were filed very quickly. TROs, temporary restraining orders, basically where federal judges were ordering the government to reinstate the students. Courts were issuing temporary restraining orders and orders ordering the students to be reinstated left and right. I think it was a real victory. Um, as that was happening, the government reviewed its approach. And lo and behold, I think this was early April. The government changed course and these records were reinstated pretty quickly after the litigation began. We represent universities across the country. With the universities that we represent, it appears that almost all of the SEVIS terminations that were based upon any kind of interaction with the law have been reinstated. And remember, some of them were really small, right? It was things like traffic violations or speeding and things like that. So those in large part have been reinstated. When the government reversed course, the government basically said that they were reinstating the records until a final policy and procedure could be developed. So certainly a win on litigation. Query whether there will be further actions by the government, however, with regard to looking at the CVIS records and future actions and potential procedures for folks that were included in these prior terminations. So I think it's very good news. I think what we're not seeing as much in terms of impact, and luckily I think the impact here is much smaller, are the CVIS terminations that may be related to political activity. I think they're in a different class. But we have not seen necessarily the reinstatements there. I was just on a call with my committee yesterday, the DOS liaison committee. Um, Department of State, it appears in some cases, is also reinstating visas, but that appears to be few and far between. We're actually trying to collect examples of that happening. But for the most part, we're not seeing Department of State reinstating the visas. But as Karen said, I think the impact there is much smaller because the government often is taking the position now that those visa revocations were prudential visa revocations. So I think that's where we stand. Now, in light of time, Karen,
Yeah.
I think we use these slides as a further resource.
I agree. I was just gonna, yeah.
And we've kind of talked about the topic, so we'll share these slides through Penn after the presentation. But it's a really good outline for all of you that summarizes everything that Karen and I have already said.
And I think even though we ran out of time, one of the way we structured the presentation sort of intentionally to highlight the issues that are going on, the problems that we're seeing, but to sort of end on the hopeful, right? Which is, people are getting non-immigrant visas. People are getting extensions of their non-immigrant status in the US. People are pursuing green cards. We're going to do a little thing on the various routes to a green card and that kind of thing. So, I guess just in terms of, final thoughts, there's a lot going on and, a lot of these things are dynamic. But people are still coming and, I know Rudy, Elise and I and all those at ISS are, enthusiastic supporters of the amazing students and foreign nationals, that come and lend their skills to our country.
So I want to sincerely thank Elise and Karen for lending their time and expertise to our community today. And to everyone who joined us, thank you for your thoughtful questions that you sent to us and for taking an active role in understanding the immigration landscape. Don't hesitate to reach out to ISSS for further guidance. And remember, you're not alone in this process. We as a community at Penn are here to support you every step of the way. We will definitely bring back Karen and Elise this coming summer for follow-up conversations during which they will share the latest updates and developments in the ever-evolving landscape. I know there's so many questions, even myself, I would like to ask, but they will be back. I promise you, we're looking forward to seeing all of you, whether you're returning as a student or scholar, or joining us for the first time as new international students or scholars. Wishing you safe travels and a wonderful summer. We are recording this. We will post this in our YouTube channel and also in our other social media platforms here. We are at a room capacity, so a lot of you were not able to join us, but definitely it will be posted as soon as we're done with this. We cannot wait to welcome many of you this fall. Have a great, great day, everyone. Thank you, Elise and Karen, again. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rudy.
Thanks, Rudy.